to yet another session of the Delphi Economic Forum. My name is Nikos Efstathiou, and I'm the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Lifo. And we're here to talk about the omnipresent question of the EU defense industry. I have to tell you, in the majority of my adult life, this is a question we've all been discussing. But there is a paradox here. We have a continent that hosts probably some of the most technologically advanced military and defense industries in the world, but simultaneously, the resistance by a lot of member states to give up this part of their national sovereignty and align and join forces as Europe. I do have to say, the context now has shifted, so it is time to reopen this dialogue and see whether we can talk about a new era in the EU defense industry, particularly with a war waging right around the corner, and with a lot of recent developments. And I think hosting this conversation in Greece is always of particular significance because it's a point that Greece has sort of been trying to hammer. So I'm very delighted that I am joined today with two very distinguished speakers, Mr. Karel Lannoo, CEO of the Center for European Policy Studies, as well as Mrs. Elena Lazarou, a fellow at ELIAMEP and the head of external policies at the European Parliament Research Service. Thank you both for being here. So I'm going to start with Mr. Lannoo and ask you if you could sort of map for us this debate on EU defense industry, and how have we seen recent geopolitical changes alter the situation that we're at right now?
Thank you. A pleasure to be here and happy to speak about this issue, certainly after the Minister of Defense and after the Top General. But if you listen to both of them, I mean, what you hear is that, I mean, the EU dimension is a bit there, but very limited. I mean, the Minister and General have much more spoken about the geopolitical role here of Greece in the Mediterranean towards other countries more towards the south, rather than, let's say, the EU dimension. What is now the EU dimension, and I think extremely important, yesterday here the former Hellenic president said, look, we need to have a European army. But the week before I was in Brussels listening to the Czech President Pavel, who was speaking, who said, no, we don't need a European army. We certainly don't need a European army, therefore we have NATO. I think if you look forward, if we are so dependent on NATO today, we know what may happen in the United States in 2 years, or what may happen in 6 years in the United States. We need to have much more of an own capacity on the military level. If you look at it today, we have defense industries which are basically all working with national targets, not with European targets. Of course, we heard also from the defense minister that Breton is now circling the capitals to say, look, we need to know what is your munition capacity. But basically, so far, we have not integrated our defense industries, and for one of the most important reasons is that defense is excluded from European public procurement rules. Right. So, for everything which public services do in the public goods are contracted by public authorities, you have to follow EU public procurement rules, not for defense. What does that mean? Is that our defense industries do not need to cooperate with each other, are not interoperable, do not work with the same standards. If you have public procurement for certain areas, this gives the way for the EU to say, look, we should standardize some of these criteria by which you, for example, procure services, procure goods. Take, for example, munitions. We have to supply now Ukraine with similar munitions, but the problem is we have all different, requirements for the national defense industries, depending on the kind of tanks or the kind of artillery which they're using. And they're not necessarily compatible, because public procurement and defense is seen to be a national competence. But then we are faced with a threat in the East, a huge threat in the East, and what does Putin see? Our defense industries are totally kind of not interoperable. We speak different languages in the defense ministries, and of course there have been attempts to do this, and NATO is trying to do this, but we shouldn't forget, NATO is an intergovernmental organization which simply sets targets for every minister. And they have to, you see this in the meetings of NATO, they're sitting all around the table and they have to agree amongst them, basically by unanimity. Of course, then there is the big brothers there, US is putting its fist on the table saying, no, you have to agree. But in an EU context, you can basically agree with qualified majority voting, which, of course, we know in foreign policy we're debating, but that's extremely difficult to agree upon. but which we could get if we were to say in the domain of public procurement, we open it up for defense, we make a small change to the treaty, and from that basis, we try to start to integrate European defense forces. And we let the EU start to work on interoperability of all the logistics which we need for European armies, which we don't have today. And this is so crucial because I think that Putin looks at Europe, he says, I shouldn't care about Europe, because if I see today, I mean, Breton has to go around and for munition, and they hardly have the capacity. So we are not deterrent, we are not sufficiently deterrent for the big bear in the East, because our industries are not basically sufficiently interoperable and are working in, I would say, prehistoric national ways, but not in a European ways, which are the things of today. Of course, the minister also said a moment ago, and then we get funds from the EU. The EU has only since very recently started a European peace facility, which is in the context of the EU budget, which is, I think, about 7 billion, which can be used to do this. Of course, there is money, they can use to do it. But that should be the basis to make sure that we create a much more European industry rather than a national industry. Again, if I listen to your minister, he was speaking essentially, our national industries, we have to create employment, we have to have the national contract. We should think much more European, because basically, why do we have defense? It's not to be attacked, to defend ourselves against Italy or against Germany. No, we have to have it from a European perspective, because we have to defend Europe against other enemies, like for today from the East, but it may from other places as well. And that we don't have. The spirit should be there, that our logistics should be integrated at European level. And that you could do to say, look, we open public procurement, a very small change to European rules, and we will make sure that we are much more interoperable, have much more similar weaponry at European level.
So the need for this common European industry, as you said, is quite clear. I'm wondering, Ms. Lazarou, if you think that the conditions for this have started to be created. So do you think we're closer to that step? And what do you think are some of the challenges that we will meet ahead to have the spirit of unity first, and then to sort of work it and actually create this common European industry?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you to the forum for having me. I think this is a timely debate on a task that looks like David's task against Goliath, because to integrate the EU defense industry, it's not a new idea. It started about 10 years ago at least with a very famous European Council, and all the vulnerabilities of the EU's defense industry that make this difficult are apparent, they're known, they're on paper, and yet we have moved until, I would say, the launch of Russia's illegal war against Ukraine, we moved very slowly in that direction. I think to understand why there are challenges that are very significant, we have to think about what is the EU, or the European even, because let's not forget the relationship with the United Kingdom and Norway. What is the European defense industry? The European defense industry is made up, as Karel said, of national companies predominantly. None of them in the top 10 in the world. There are a few that are in the top 20, but when we compare with the US footprint, for example, or even the Chinese, in terms of large companies that are able to produce large sort of military platforms, there are very few and in specific countries. There's about 2,000 small and medium-sized enterprises in the industry in Europe. I think that's an important point also for Greece, because that means the EU is looking to incentivize the inclusion of those companies on whatever it does. The employment of roughly 500,000 personnel across Europe. It's important to think of the size, I think, and just to give you a sense of comparison, Lockheed Martin, which is the biggest defense industrial company in the world, American, so the revenue of Lockheed Martin per year is about 3/4 of the revenue of all the EU defense industry together. So it is important to know what we're talking about. So the first challenge, I think, is apparent in terms of the industry itself and how it compares globally and competes globally. The second challenge is that until recently, I would say, by and large, the EU as a whole, not the individual countries, is operating under an assumption of peace. And what that means is that investment in the defense industry is not necessarily the priority. So in defense industry, as I'm sure many of you here know, is an industry which requires two very basic things, time and money. the time required to research, prototype, and produce military equipment is, the cycle is over 10 years for some equipment. And the money is such that the majority of major defense industries do not operate without having a contract in advance. What that means, therefore, is that production had declined for a very long time, and it was not being incentivized by any large orders, so that gap had to be covered. Other vulnerabilities, I think, that deserve to be mentioned, and Karel alluded to that, of course, is the fragmentation. Right. The national procurement, I mean, 80% of procurement is done nationally, so not across the EU, even though we have those directives that tried to incentivize that over 10 years ago. So fragmentation, every member state has its own military trade relations with third countries. Lack of interoperability, which means because it's a fragmented defense industry, it was very likely to produce, the EU until recently was producing about 17 different types of military aircraft, and which were not necessarily able to interoperate. So for example, on refueling issues, we could not have one single platform because we have different models of planes. So that is also a very big challenge. And then of course, as I said, the financial issues and the different models there. Are we at a good moment to sort of surpass all these obstacles? We are at a better moment than before. And I say there's 3 reasons for that, and one I think is the geopolitical context. There is nothing like a crisis to make anyone, when you want to lose weight, you don't, and then a doctor comes and says, you're gonna die if you don't lose weight, and then suddenly you stop eating. So I think this is kind of where we are now, in a way. So that's, I think, the crisis. Secondly, there is some money to incentivize collaboration, which is really an important element. Now, the money, and experts say so rightly, it's not a lot, but there is some money. There's money from the EU to incentivize collaboration, initially in research and prototyping. We've seen that already with the European Defence Fund. It's already working in a way. And now money is going to be put in joint procurement, which means supporting member states in buying together. And what that means is, hopefully, there'll be contracts and industry will ramp up production. And of course, there's money coming from different ways, off budget from the peace facility, but also now with some new regulations that are being voted on to the EU's budget. So there's money, there's a reason, there seems to be political will. So I think, yes, we're in a good moment, but of course, the devil is in the details.
And as you said, the task is kind of Herculean. And one of the reasons why I believe is the fact that perhaps to first get a common defense industry, there needs to be a trust in the idea and the possibility of a common EU foreign policy. And maybe this is hindering a lot of defense industries from wanting to open up and collaborate and leads to this fragmentation. And perhaps this is a point that resonates a lot with the Greek audience that has occasionally expressed their discontent with the fact that the Greek foreign policy is not always very aligned clearly with the EU foreign policy. So Mr. Lannoo, do you think that it is a prerequisite to sort of have a more common and clear EU foreign policy? Or do you think that perhaps unifying the defense industries can be a catalyst to achieve that?
I think it's more the second rather than the first, of course. And that's the interesting thing of being here, speaking to people and saying, look, have we advanced with Europe in our common foreign policy over the last year? And you hear different voices. So one person says yes, another person would say no. Like I could refer to your former president also yesterday, who said, we need to have a common European foreign policy, but he has seen us receding rather than progressing. He said in public yesterday. I think if you speak to people in Brussels, some people would say, yeah, but the sanctions, for example, which also have to be adopted with unanimity, we have managed to do 10 packages. We are discussing now the 11th package of sanctions against Russia, which is not unconsiderable. And also in other domains, we have done a lot, I would say, over the last years, but I think it's moving on very slowly, and that's why I also refer to what your Minister of Defense said. I mean, the orientation of Greece, for example, if you're here in this country, is much more towards the south, to, well, let's say, its geopolitical role here, than thinking about, for example, what you would have in northwestern Europe, which is a totally different orientation. But I think, let's say, it's more, and the way I've seen it is that what we've done, for example, after the financial crisis, is creating this European stability mechanism. We knew it was extremely difficult to change something in the treaty and to add more competences to the EU. We can only do very minor steps. I mean, doing big treaty changes is almost impossible. To say, for example, we will now move to qualified majority voting in foreign policy. I don't think we will manage to do this now. What we could do is probably have these small steps And if we were to say, look, to the public, we've seen what we've learned from this war, that we need to have a much more common defense. Let's start with integrating our industries, like we've done it in many other areas. The start of the EU also was start to create our heavy industries, like with steel in the 1950s and so on. Do it in defense industries as well. Lift this issue that public procurement is not applicable to defense and say, look, we've broken that up. And this is only one small article of the treaty, which is Article 346, 1B, is it that? So if you want to check it, and you change this, and then you give a sign to the public opinion at large, look, we want to make this change because we think long-term, as Elena was saying, these are long-term issues. If we start gradually, probably in 5 to 10 years, we have a much more integrated defense industry, and it will be a much more bigger deterrent towards those who would like to attack us. Because we have all seen, and that's probably the good thing, sorry to say, of this war, how precious our European model is of democracy, which some want to attack and some don't like. Right. Some prefer to have autocracies and just with force change the entire system.
So I have a similar question to point. If you also agree that this is the interplay with the common foreign policy versus common defense, do we need the one first, or can the defense industry be a catalyst for the latter? But also a question for the Greek defense industry specifically. What do you think it has to gain from this idea of unifying and having a more common European defense industry? And what do you think it can offer as competitive advantages, if you will, to this general European defense industry that we're discussing?
You're asking me this question after the minister spoke and the head of the armed forces on Greece, but I'll try that too. But just to go back to the first question, I think we have to separate some things with regard to the common foreign security policy and defense industrial issues. The European defense industrial dimension and its future is a foreign and security topic and issue, but it's also an internal market issue, and it's also a technology and research issue. So there are many dimensions to it, and in many ways, and I'll come to this later, this also makes it a very dual-use issue, not just in terms of what's produced, but also in terms of security. So just to explain what I mean, it's also about bringing together defense industry and the civilian industry to guarantee security with regard to external issues, but also internal security through, for example, the types of satellite independence that you will have in satellite navigation, satellite surveillance. This is not just about defense and how we relate with the outside world. It's also about how we live inside Europe. So I just want to make that distinction. This is also why defense industrial issues are slowly becoming part of Commission competence. So we have a Director General that deals with defense industry and space, while the direction of foreign policy of the EU remains with the member states. It is very institutional, but I think it really tells a story there. Now, do I think one is the prerequisite for the other? I think in one way, yes, political will, the decision to do something about an issue. And we had a very big summit in Versailles of the leaders last year where they decided defense is a priority. And that meant that it became a priority for industry and security policy. So yes, political will and a common orientation is a priority for anything. It presupposes it. We're at a good moment, again I say, because last year a document was produced, the Strategic Compass, which is a document that all member states agreed on and produced together. And they came up with a joint threat assessment of the 27 EU member states. We had never had something like this before. And a joint threat assessment means that the 27 member states have decided together that there are specific threats that the EU will collectively address. Now, what's interesting about this document is, because you mentioned that Greece may have its own concerns and other countries don't, the concerns of all the member states are in there. There's not a list, what's the first or second priority, but they're all there, which means that whatever EU defense policy manages to achieve and whatever the defense industry produces in terms of capabilities will be put to use for all these threats. So there's a common investment and a common interest by all member states in having that development in its defense industry and those autonomous capabilities to defend Europe. So I think that in itself, the fact that there is this joint threat assessment, which by the way will be repeated on a biannual or every 5 years basis, I think that's really something that is behind I would say, very dynamic and very accelerated effort to move towards that. A second interest that I think permeates all member states, and that's strictly industrial, is that there is no way in today's world for a country on its own or a company on its own to produce capabilities that are needed, particularly because technology has become so important, which means you may be producing the carcass of something, but you need the chips for it to operate. And to have those chips, you need to have your secure supply chains to get the materials that will go in the chips. Most military equipment requires, for example, aluminum and graphite, which most countries don't produce. So supply chains are key to the defense industry. And with the plans that are being proposed, those supply chains will, to a much larger percentage, be spread out across the EU member states. There's ways to incentivize this in the plans. So I think it becomes a common industrial interest also of all member states to work together. For Greece, because you asked that, and again, I speak very reluctantly because we've just heard the minister, there's a couple of things that are very interesting because of the SME dimension, the small and medium-sized enterprise in technology, the emphasis on dual-use companies, that means technology, robotics, artificial intelligence companies that can do both things, civilian and defense. Those are going to get financing from the programs, including from the investment bank. Yesterday or the day before, there was a proposal for the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, for example, that gives more beneficial terms for lending and repayment, including for defense purposes. So Greece can benefit from that. Greece is very well respected because it's one of the countries that has always, for a very long time, surpassed the 2% GDP spending in defense. And then, of course, there's another issue which we haven't talked about, which is one big vulnerability of the defense sector in the EU is skills and human resources. Because of the competition with the private sector, there is an issue with employment skills and age even of those working in the defense industry. And I think Greece has a very high percentage of skilled young labor force in high tech. So I think there is a lot there that can be done.
Very interesting. And I want to conclude, given that we're pressed with time, with a question to both of you, inspired sort of by your last response, which is this idea that we have entered well into the fourth industrial revolution. It's really radically changing a lot of industries. I don't think we talk enough about how it's transforming the defense industry. So where do you see the future of defense heading with all of these things like AI, more autonomous system, more precision, high precision systems? And what will the European model look like? What do you think Europe brings to this equation of the future of the defense industry as it's really rapidly changing nowadays? Response from both of you. Do you want to go first to sort of upset the...
Sure. I mean, you may know there's a wide trend for the last 6-7 years for governmental organizations and companies to do foresight. And for many years, one very important element of foresight is the future of warfare. So a few years ago, the future of warfare was, all the papers would be about, unmanned aerial vehicles waging the war of the future, plus cyber attacks. Everything was technology. Now, Russia's war in Ukraine has shown us that it's even a bigger problem because we have that kind of warfare, technological, disruptive, hybrid, and conventional warfare, which means industry has to do two things, essentially. It has to go high-tech, and it has to continue, though, producing, infantry fighter vehicles and classic and shells, 155 millimeter shells. So we're on a dual track, I think, for the type of warfare we see. However, in other theaters around the world, high tech may be playing a more important role in the kind of warfare that's being waged. So as we look forward, I think indeed not only drones, but also the way artificial intelligence can be included in military capabilities, but also biosynthetics, other types of biological warfare. All these require a really exceptional degree of scientific expertise. So I think looking forward, we'll be seeing that come in a lot. But we have to also look backward and know that every time there was a revolution in warfare, it was because of the state-of-the-art technology at the time. And nuclear, for example, at the time was the state-of-the-art technology.
I have to say a very quick point on what you said. I read recently how civilian technology, sort of everyday, common day technology, is very much used in the war in Ukraine. So Ukrainian soldiers get civilian drones, 3D print, very cheap bullets, shoot down very expensive high-tech Russian tanks. This is another interesting point, I think, too, that you mentioned before, how it's also internally how industry grows really affects war as well. And a concluding remark from you, Mr.
I think, let's say, what we need to do, I mean, it just underscores my point, which I try to make, let's say, that we need to pool expertise, and certainly because once you speak about digitalization, AI, I mean, whatever high-level technologies, I mean, this expertise is very scarce. Also imagine, I mean, the EU has 27, of which very many small member states which have very limited expertise, which really want to share expertise, and it doesn't make any sense, let's say, that, of course, only a few big countries could go ahead and the others would be left behind. By the way, we have an example at the moment. We are discussing an anti-missile shield, and we see, I mean, which is also high-tech. The technology comes basically from two countries. It's Israel or the United States. We don't have it on ourselves. We see one country, Germany, with a few others going one direction and another country going in another direction. I mean, everybody would say that doesn't make any sense. But these industries or these ways of reasoning at the national level are still, I would say, in another age. I mean, sometimes I'm surprised if I come into these kind of national debates and you say, how is it possible? And of course, one of the questions I got here, for example, was about Germany and what is happening in Germany with its European policy. If you look at Germany on defense, which are all committed to spend much more in defense, will it really look at this European dimension? I don't know. And that is the big challenge. And that's why we need to really wake it up to say, look, it only makes sense also to keep our EU together, to also protect smaller states. Think about the Baltic states, which are so much under threat today, to do it together and to also show them, look, we will develop these capacities, these high-tech capacities also in the military domain together rather than do it one for one. Also because we know if we do it together, money-wise, I think the money will be much better spent than if you do it in a dispersed way.
Thank you so much for a snappy discussion. I think we got really in depth, so thank you both for your remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you.